Well, hello there, little brother. I am reshooting the video that I promised you about how to, get some of the basics on your camera. This time I will endeavor to be more concise and not ramble on quite as much. Of course you don't know because you didn't see the other one. Anyhow, to jump right into it, on your new Sony Alpha camera, interchangeable lens system. It's very handy. The last we spoke, you were looking at getting a telephoto lens, and that will help considerably with your shooting and creating different styles with the video and photos and so on. Just to kind of give you a brief overview on all of that stuff with photography and even the video stuff. The first thing I'll cover is the photography. There's three basic things that you'll want to pay attention to whenever you're shooting with your camera, and when you're not using the automatic mode. So I prefer the manual mode. It gives me a little more control over the end result of what I want. That's the M on the top dial. The green auto mode, that there is usually for somebody who doesn't want to mess with all that stuff. But if you want to have specific results with your camera, there are three things that you will adjust. Those three things are ISO, which adjusts the image sensitivity, the sensor sensitivity. There's the f-stop, also known as the aperture, and then there's the shutter speed. So all of those things adjust the way that light goes into the camera. So with ISO, that's something that you'll use the lowest number when in the brightest conditions. So outdoors, like on today, it's very sunny, I would have an ISO setting of probably 100, maybe 200 max. But if I were doing that, it would probably be for some sort of high-speed type shooting where I have the shutter very, very fast. ISO, if you use it in low light, for example indoors, the higher the number, the more noise and grain that will be introduced into the photo. So on large photos it's not so noticeable, but if you start to blow up a photo or digitally zoom in to a photo, that grain and that noise will be more pronounced, and it will detract from the quality of the picture, that's for sure. The f-stop, also known as the aperture, you'll find those numbers on your lenses. For example, this 18 to 250 lens has an aperture or f-stop of 3.5 to 6.3. So aperture refers to how wide open the iris is in the lens, and that adjusts how much light gets into the sensor. So the more open the aperture, the more light there is. The smaller the aperture, the less light there is. As it turns out, aperture also affects what's called the depth of field, or the background and foreground defocus. So if you want to have a character who is very sharp and clear, but you want the foreground or the background to be out of focus, you'll actually want to have a more open aperture, or the smaller the number, so it'll be very large. As you shrink the aperture, raise the number of the f-stop, then your depth of field will actually expand, and you'll have more items in focus. So the foreground will become clearer, the background will become clearer, and it tends to also flatten a picture so that everything looks like it's all on one plane rather than being further apart and having depth to it. So where possible, you can adjust aperture, and you can exceed the value, at least on the high end, high number. So you could take the 6.3 on the aperture here, you could actually push it to a 7.1 or an 8 or a 10 or even 20, 25 to really flatten out pictures if that's what you desire to do. You can't go the other way. 3.5 is the bare minimum, for example, on this lens. You can't bring it down any further than that, and that's just a function of the lens itself. If you find a lens out there that's a 2.8 or a 1.8, that means it has the ability to open up for a very wide aperture. Great for low light shooting because more light gets in. When you're shooting high-speed subjects, you'll want to adjust the shutter speed, and that is how long that iris is open when it does in fact take the picture. So if you look at the settings, you may be able to adjust them with the dial that's on the camera. It's either on the front or the back, I don't remember on your model. And it measures it in seconds, the shutter speed. So you'll have 1/10 of a second, 1/50th of a second, 1/250th of a second, 1/1000th of a second, and so on. Going the other way for long exposures, say you're taking a picture at night hopefully your subject is still, you can actually do 1 second, 2 seconds, 5 seconds, all the way up to 30 seconds until finally you get to a mode that's known as bulb, which simply leaves the shutter open for an indeterminate amount of time until you shut it off. But bear in mind, the longer that the shutter is open, the more motion blur that will occur when you're taking that photo. So if you want somebody who's running to have that field of effect like of motion, you'll actually want a slower shutter speed, so like 1/10 of a second or 1/15 of a second, for example, and that way they'll still be blurred when they're running. But if you want to capture the person and have them freeze, then you want the faster shutter speed, 1/100th, 1/200th of a second or faster. For example, on my timeline you see the picture of the bee landing on the flowers and he's almost stopped. That was at a high shutter speed in order to get those wings on the bee very nearly stopped and looking like he was frozen in midair. So with a little more practice, I hope to actually get those bees completely frozen, like caught in midair. I think it would be pretty cool. When it comes to video, the one aspect of those things that you'll have the most control over on the camera will be ISO. So the maximum range on that camera, it goes up to a 1600 ISO. So decent low light performance, you know, without sacrificing too much of the video quality with grain and noise. And there are other cameras out there that do exceed those values, but again, the picture gets very noisy, very grainy, and it's not of a quality that's, in my opinion, acceptable for a lot of things. So, you know, it's kind of take it with a grain of salt. There is, you know, plenty of tools out there, post-production that you can use, you know, Vegas Movie Studio, for example. So even if you do capture it at a certain, you know, setting on your camera, you can always go in and adjust those things after the fact. It just takes work and time. So that's pretty much all that I got for you right now. The great thing about a digital camera is you can take a bunch of photos. If you don't like them, delete them. You didn't have to spend any money on film or anything like that. But enjoy the capability to now be more creative with your filmmaking and, you know, pursue your career and your craft and really produce some extraordinary results. And good luck. Break a leg.